They learned my name before I learned theirs. I remember the exact smell of that house the night it began. Mildew warmed by old radiators, a faint metallic tang like pennies rubbed between wet fingers, and the stale sweetness of someone else's perfume lingering in rooms no one else used. I say house, but it felt more like an organism, a ribbed, patient thing that inhaled through the vents and exhaled through the floorboards. I moved in thinking I was escaping noise. Instead, I traded one silence for a heavier, wiser hush that listened. My name is Jacob. I took the lease because the landlord promised quiet, and because the price was small for a place with a crooked skylight and a view of the canal. The first week was ordinary. Boxes, IKEA lamps with missing screws, late-night takeout. Then, on the fourth night, I woke to the sensation of someone standing at the foot of my bed. Not the usual sudden onset adrenaline of a nightmare, but a slow, patient presence that felt like a shadow pressing down through the mattress. I opened my eyes. The room was dark, in the way dark becomes when you stop expecting things to be visible, an accumulation of small absences. There was no figure. There was only a dry, disturbed pattern in the dust on the dresser, as if someone had dragged their fingertips across it in a long, careful line. The line spelled nothing my sleepy brain could make sense of, but it hummed with intent. When I sat up, the air tasted like pennies. My phone read 3:07 a.m., battery at 42%. Insignificant details that suddenly felt like evidence in a case I hadn't wanted to investigate. After that night, the house learned to disturb me softly. A kettle would click off in the kitchen when I had no water on. A door hinge would sigh exactly 3 times before stilling, and the corridor light would flare when I walked past it with my hands full. I tried to be rational. Mice, faulty wiring, the mind's tendency to conjure patterns. But rationality started to fray at the edges. My reflection paused a fraction too long in the bathroom mirror, and the radiator's steam seemed to form shapes that unspooled the longer I looked. People told me to leave. Friends shrugged and used words like stress and overwork. The truth is simpler and worse. Leaving was never entirely mine to decide. The house had a way of choosing the nights it wanted company, and the nights it wanted confession. On those nights, the silence was not empty. It was full of patient attention, as if the very walls were studying the cadence of my breathing, memorizing the way my voice broke on certain vowels. I began to dream of voices behind the plaster. They were not loud. They whispered like pages being turned, close enough to make the skin at the back of my neck tighten. When I woke, there would be wet footprints on the hallway tiles, not sized for any shoe I owned. The floor would still hold the impression, as if something heavy and deliberate had walked through a puddle of cold oil and then vanished into the grout. I should have left that night. I didn't. They began to answer when I stopped pretending I couldn't hear them. At first, the replies were small, faint echoes that braided with the pipes. A soft rasping that replied to my cough. A wet chuckle that settled into the space between sentences when I spoke aloud to myself. I started leaving notes in the kitchen, childish scraps with reminders like milk and pay internet, and would find them folded differently in the morning, the handwriting smeared as if read with damp fingertips. Once I wrote, "Who are you?" and left the paper on the counter like evidence. That night, the kettle boiled without fire, and the answer was waiting on the note in ink I did not own, your voice. I stopped sleeping in the bed altogether. The mattress felt porous now, like it had taken a memory of me and kept it. I moved the small futon into the living room, where the skylight opened to the Black River. From there, the water reflected the moon in a way that looked like eyes. I told myself to be brave and went down to the canal one night, flashlight clutched between my palms. The boards creaked beneath me, the air smelled of algae and old rust, and every time the beam crossed the surface, I thought I heard breathing under the water. Then 2 pale faces surfaced a few yards from the bank, eyes blown wide, grinning with the patient, stupid delight of things that have waited long enough to forget mercy. They didn't swim. They bobbed like anchored dolls, necks holding them upright, as if strings went down into the black. I clicked off the light, and they tilted their heads in unison, like creatures listening. One of them mouthed my name. It was not speech so much as the movement of lips that had learned to imitate human shapes. I ran, and the reflection of their faces followed me in the puddles left by my boots, in the windows of shuttered houses, and later, in the television when a test pattern flickered, 2 pale heads where static should be. Back inside, the house escalated. Doors opened to emptiness that smelled of cold iron. The walls thinned at night until I could hear the river's lazy swallowing, as if the house itself had become a throat. I found an old photograph behind a loose tile in the hall. Two boys on a summer pier, laughing with their arms thrown around each other's shoulders. Their faces had been scratched out, gouged so the paper showed the bleaching beneath, but the indentations were shaped like the faces in the water, too round, too wide-eyed. Someone had tried to erase them and failed. Underneath, in a hand that trembled, was written in faded pencil, "We promise to come back." I stopped answering the phone. My friends' messages multiplied into a chorus of worry, advice, jokes. When I finally listened to one voice message, there was only my own breathing, slow and layered over another breath that I had not made. I began losing time. Hours would vanish between the sound of the kettle and the next remembered moment. I would stand in rooms with my hands full and realize I could not remember why I had walked there. On a mirror, written with a finger that fogged the glass, were the words, "Stay." The letters were patient, deliberate, as if someone had traced them many times to make sure they would not wash away. The house had changed the rules. It did not demand screams. It wanted something else: attendance, confession, witnesses. And when I tried to leave, my keys would vanish. When I tried to lock a door, the deadbolt turned back toward me on its own. Once, in the hallway, I found a row of small footprints leading toward my bedroom. Not from shoes, not from any animal I could name, as if something with flat, deliberate soles had walked through a tray of ash and then up the stairs. They stopped at the foot of the futon, and the air there smelled like pennies and the scent of someone else's perfume, two odors that now meant only one thing: company was coming. I thought the worst would be waking to find them in my bed. I was wrong. The worst was learning how patient the river could be. The nights narrowed until every sound became a vocabulary I could parse. The house spoke in the clink of a spoon, the sigh of a hinge, the careless drip that always landed exactly where I stood. The river answered in broader syllables, a long, slow swallow that sounded like a wooden gate closing somewhere far away. I began to sense a timetable, quiet for an hour, then an insistence that gathered like a congregation outside the walls. Whatever waited in the water kept its own clock, and on the nights when the clock matched mine, the world rearranged itself. I tried to fight back with light and noise. I left every lamp on and played music until the speakers rattled. I shouted until my voice cracked. For a while, that bristled the air enough to make them recede. The kettle did not boil on its own. The notes I left remained untouched. But the house learned to listen around my defenses. It started echoing my own recordings back to me with a sluggish delay, my laughter a hair too slow, my apology stretched like taffy. The faces in the river began to mirror that lag. They would smile a fraction behind my real smile, as if practicing being me. On the night it finished with me, the sky was a low, wet blanket, and the moon was a coin someone had dropped into a drain. I went down to the bank because leaving felt like admitting defeat, and because I needed a witness who wasn't made of plaster. The walk there was a procession of small betrayals. My keys refusing to bite the lock, the doormat refusing to lay flat. When I reached the dock, the water was a mirror that had learned to breathe. Two heads surfaced, closer now, their skin the color of old paper. They watched me with a flat adoration of something that has practiced wanting. I stepped forward because my feet were no longer my own. The river smelled of pennies and perfume, those two signatures, stitched together into a familiar language. One of the faces lifted its mouth and shaped my name with the same slow child uses to form a secret. I answered without meaning to. My voice came out of the space between them before I knew I had opened my mouth. Hands, cold wrong, took my wrists. They were wet and slick, and the touch did not startle me the way it should have. Instead, it felt like recognition. The water closed over our knees, then our waists, then our shoulders, and with each inch, the air tasted more metallic and less of my own breath. Through the sheet of dark, I could see their smiles sharpen, not in malice, but in the relief of a promise kept. When the current finally took me, I did not sink first. I watched the surface reel like a curtain, and through it I saw myself reflected twice, one face above the other, both grinning with that patient, stupid delight the photographs had tried and failed to erase. My mouth opened to scream, and the sound came back layered with another voice, soft and accurate, making it rhyme to an old lullaby I had never learned. I do not know how long I lasted in that place between air and water before the house stopped keeping time for me and started keeping me. I know only that when they let me go, if they did, I carried the smell of pennies in my lungs and the memory of a smile that was not quite mine. They learned my name.
Subscribe to Horror Story Bar.